For the first time on the channel since moving into this new space, today we're printing another creature from the D&D Monster Manual. In an effort to one day have a complete collection of minis for every creature in this book, we're printing, assembling, and painting them all, one mini at a time. So why don't we go ahead and see which mini we'll be working on today. The Death Tyrant. When I spun this on the wheel a couple of days ago now, I knew this was an awesome pick. An Undead beholder. Pretty cool, right? But when I opened the book and had a closer look, what I discovered is that these creatures are not simple undead, but almost better described as the beholder's version of a lich. With a challenge rating higher than a standard beholder, these are terrifying monsters made stronger in undeath. The shell of a beholder, but driven by something far more primal, and all that remains of its famous eyes are a collection of ghostly orbs that radiate power. Taking to my mini factory, I started having a look for possible Death Tyrant models, and while there are actually quite a few sculpts that look very similar to the official designs, there was one in particular that caught my eye. The only model that I thought really sold the ghostly undead vibe of the Death Tyrant's powers. This model by Crippled God Foundry. And this mini actually matches really closely to what I think is one of the coolest artworks of a Death Tyrant from this Magic the Gathering card. Not a clean bone-white skull, but rather one still laden with necrotic flesh, barely clinging to the skull underneath. So I think this is the model we'll be going with today. And taking a look at this kit, it appears to come with some pretty robust pre-supported files. So we'll go ahead and use Resin 2 FDM to process these for FDM printing. Some of these pieces, however, do seem to have some supports that are going to be a little tricky to print. I'm looking specifically at these standalone supports that reach quite high without really being connected to anything. And this is a very possible fail point when printing in FDM. So we're actually going to use some new features in Resin 2 FDM that will be coming out in the next week or so. We'll go ahead and first split our model as usual, but before assigning miniature, we'll go ahead and actually add some reinforcement to some of these possibly problematic supports. With our problematic support selected, and another one to use as bracing, I'll open up support reinforcement and add a cross brace. This will essentially connect these two supports with an additional piece of geometry so that there is something to help stabilize these supports before they get to the very top where they connect to the model. And I can do this multiple times by selecting our problematic support again and selecting a different support to brace it to and adding that brace. And I'll just go ahead and do this around our whole model on anywhere that also seems to have this issue. And now that I'm happy with the support reinforcement, I'll just go ahead and assign our miniature as usual. Most of these supports already look pretty chunky, so I think I'll just go ahead and set this to 0.14 for our thickness and apply that modifier before repairing both the model and supports. And another new feature that'll be coming in that update in a week or so is actually outputting this file with our support settings already dialed in. As we can see in the preferences for Resin 2 FDM, there is now an Orca Slicer support settings area, where we can actually input the slicer settings that we want the supports to import with. For this print, I'll be using my 0.08mm profile, so I need this layer height to be at 0.16. But as we can see down here, I've already actually created a preset for 0.08mm printing. So closing this, looking down at the 3MF export tab, I can now change my support settings to that 0.08 and export as a 3MF file. And if we go ahead and open that exported project, we can see that our supports have exported with these settings already dialed in and ready to slice. And just like that, our model is processed, imported, and sliced, ready to head over to the printer. And once again, these updates to Resin 2 FDM will be dropping in the next week or so here on the channel, so be sure to keep an eye out for when those go live. Some beholders, those crazed or powerful enough, pursue their goals even beyond death, rising from the corpses of slain beholders or twisted from exposure to strange magics or elements. Often formed by sheer happenstance, but sometimes for those few beholders that believe they could achieve higher perfection, purposefully pursued like a mage would with lichdom. A cyclopean skull orbited by 10 magical singularities is all that remains of their once magical eyes. Just want to take a real quick moment here to say that if you are into 3D printing for the tabletop, consider checking out the Painted for Combat Patreon, where for just a couple of bucks you can get access to an awesome community Discord, all of my printer profiles, and Resin 2 FDM Advanced. Or at the higher STL tiers, get access to not only an awesome welcome bundle of printable goodies, but also our monthly STL releases of miniature bases, like our release for April, the Shattered Shale. A set of generic ruins where shale tile has been flung into dirty earth. Perfect for townsfolk fleeing a ruined town, or marines setting foot in a destroyed city. And as always, these bases have been sculpted to print support-free on FDM printers. So whether you want to join a like-minded community, pick up some awesome STLs, or just help support the channel, consider checking out Patreon with the links below. As always, a huge thank you to everyone supporting over on the Patreon, with a special shout out to our Painted for Display tier members. With this model on the table, it was a fairly simple task to break it away from the delicate resin style supports. Then, cleanup for this model was pretty standard for a resin to FDM print. As usual, the supports left a few visibly rough overhangs and plenty of small support connections expected from resin style supports. But just a few minutes with a hobby knife to nick off those support dots, and a light sand to help clean up some areas that needed it, was really all this mini needed to be ready for priming. And even at this stage, while I was taking a look at the model in front of me, I could tell this was going to look awesome if I could pull off the paint job. So let's go ahead and get this primed with a generous coat of Rust-Oleum Grey Rattlecan Primer. With our model primed, we'll go ahead and start this off with some base coating with the airbrush. Starting with a deep ochre colour over the skull of our Death Tyrant, which will be used to create a bone-like undertone before we paint in that necrotic flesh over top. But to actually make this look like bone, we need to come in with our midtones, using a desaturated warm grey, something like Ancient Stone by Army Painter. Spraying this on pretty heavily in a zenithal pattern, just leaving that ochre in the deepest recesses and undersides of the model. And before moving on, we'll actually mix a little bit of white into that stone, just to push those highlights even further, hitting just the front of the model and the raised areas. Next, it's on to all of the effects, and I think that I want to make these all a pretty vibrant pink to really sell that colour that we see in the artwork. So I'll start this with Basilisk Red, a dark pink red that I'll use to base coat all of the spell effects and add a subtle glow to the eye. And then I'll start building up some layers with more vibrant, brighter pinks. Starting off with a Wicked Pink to really boost that saturation, and then a Pixie Pink to start brightening up these effects. And with a good base coat down, we'll go ahead and head over to the painting table. We'll go ahead and start off our brushwork with a little bit more of that Wicked Pink, to help boost the saturation of this colour and really make these spell effects pop. And once we've dry brushed this Wicked Pink over all of these various effect pieces, we'll go ahead and do the same with the Pixie Pink, focusing these closer to where these orbs are going to be producing a glowing, bright light. From here, we'll go ahead and touch up the central eye, using that Basilisk Red to make sure that we get those recesses that the airbrush missed, and then starting to build up those same layers of highlights. Once again coming in with a couple of layers of Wicked Pink to boost the vibrant saturation of this colour, and then slowly, gradually mixing in some Pixie Pink to that Wicked Pink to start boosting the brightness as well. And as we continue through this paint job, you will see me returning to this eye, adding more and more white until we get to an almost pure white to really help push the glowing nature of this eye. But before we do push this to that full brightness, let's go ahead and get our model assembled so that we can start seeing everything together while we're working on it. A few drops of superglue is really all that this model needs, and even with just a couple of pieces connected, we can really start to see how this model is going to look. The truly vibrant pink against a more desaturated bone is going to look incredible once we get this finished. The next task is going to be repeating all of the steps that we did on the central eye on the small orbs surrounding the skull, bringing them up through that Wicked Pink, into Pixie Pink, and eventually mixing in some white to that mixture to really help boost the brightness of these powerful magical orbs. And at this stage, now that we can see everything together, as I mentioned before, I'll mix in some more white to that Pixie Pink and really push the brightness of the central core of the eye. And this paint job is already looking great, but let's add some more detail. Using that same ochre colour to base coat the teeth, we'll finish these later. For now, let's go ahead and move to some washes. Using a very thin mixture of some Gravelord Grey speed paint and a tiny bit of peachy flesh to cover the skull of our Death Tyrant. And I'm hoping that this will give us that withered skin look that we're going for, allowing enough of that bone colour to seep through to make it feel like something very thin, translucent, and dead is clinging to the skull underneath. And while I had the speed paints out, I also thinned down some Slaughter Red, glazing this into the recesses of the central eye before thinning it even further and washing this over the rest of the effects to once again really boost the vibrant saturation that we're going for in these areas. And as mentioned earlier, here is that pure white highlight on the eye, just in the very central area and on some of the wisps around it. And we'll also repeat this on a very small area of each of the orbs surrounding the skull. And now it's time for the last few bits of brushwork, using some skeleton bone to add some textured highlights to the teeth, before moving on to our final highlights across the flesh. For the flesh, I used that same bone colour mixed with a light grey, thinned down to glaze consistency, and used this to build up some contrast on the flesh. And I'm making sure not to push these highlights so far that they look like stark bone or living flesh, just enough to create some more interest across the surface. For the base, I want to keep this relatively simple, so I grabbed this plastic base that I had lying around with a simple dry brush of some grey. Then, using some pink to create an almost glow effect in the middle of this base, before gluing our Death Tyrant to it and seeing where we're at. A couple of final highlights is really all that this needed. And with a few final touch-ups and a lick of black around the base rim, this Death Tyrant is more than ready to hit the table. At this point, this model has been sitting on my shelf for about a day or so, and every time I walk past, I've had to go by and have a look at it. I'm really happy with how this paint job came out. I feel like I managed to pull this paint job off pretty well. The skull has just the right look to make it feel like a layer of thin dead flesh over bone, and with the contrast of that vibrant pink and bright white, it really helps this model stand out. Now, a question for you. This is our 4th video in this series at this point, so I want to know. Do you prefer when I cover multiple miniatures in a single video, or when I focus on a single model, or perhaps a single page of the monster manual for smaller things? Or do you think there should be some middle ground, where larger standout models get their own solo videos, but batches of smaller models get bunched together? Let me know down below, because I'm super keen to get properly stuck into this series in the new space. But for now, do be sure to like if you liked, subscribe for more FDM printing and tabletop projects, but most importantly, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a good one.